In the golden age of primetime television, the Smothers Brothers comedy hour arrived with charm, wit, and a sharp edge hiding beneath its polished surface. CBS had expected a safe, crowd-pleasing variety show, something to compete with Bonanza, not challenge America's conscience. But as the cultural tide of the 1960s surged, the show transformed into a lightning rod of satire, rebellion, and raw commentary. Tension behind the scenes grew thicker with every punchline that hit too close to power. And then, without warning, it happened, a moment on tape that never aired, a decision made behind closed doors, and a show erased from the schedule. The moment didn't just end a show, it exposed the limits of free speech in mainstream media. And it all started with one scene too bold to be seen. The Smothers Brothers. The rise of the Smothers Brothers. When the Smothers Brothers comedy hour debuted in 1967, it was a strategic counter-programming move by CBS to reclaim Sunday night viewers from NBC's Bonanza, a long-dominant Western drama. CBS's programming at the time favored tradition. Shows like the Beverly Hillbillies and the Ed Sullivan Show catered to a conservative, post-war American audience. Tom and Dick Smothers, known for their clean-cut musical comedy act, seemed like a safe bet to modernize the variety format without alienating mainstream viewers. Network executives viewed the brothers as entertainers who could deliver laughs without stirring controversy. The initial episodes delivered just that: light comedy, musical numbers, and the brothers' signature sibling banter. The show conformed to CBS's expectations of family-friendly television, and early feedback was positive. It gained traction with a broad viewership and met the network's goals in terms of ratings and content tone. But unlike many other variety programs, the Smothers Brothers had creative control written into their contract, a rare allowance that gave them more freedom than most performers on network television. This clause would later prove pivotal in how the show evolved beyond its original concept. Where CBS envisioned it as a ratings phenomenon, Tom and Dick made the show a creative space, waiting to be fully explored. They hired a younger, more progressive writing team. Such voices spoke with the increasingly tumultuous social seas of late 1960s life. Their very influence was saying early stylings, which transformed the energy level of the show before any explicit signs of political content were available. The show began moving away from its vaudevillian skits to more substantial, sharper, blended approaches to topical issues with ingenuity. These early structural and stylistic innovations developed into what later became a highly charged program. But at this stage, transformation was technical and tonal rather than outright ideological. By mid-1967, the Smothers Brothers comedy hour was beginning to draw a different type of audience, young viewers hungry for material relevant to the generation's culture clashes. In fact, the show's increasing popularity on college campuses and among youth culture starkly highlighted a very important turning point in network understandings of audience segments. Although taking a while to realize it, CBS was beginning to see the show as more than a time filler. It was slowly transforming into a generational redefining of television. The rise wasn't simply a ratings story. It signified an evolution of the medium itself from being passive entertainment to becoming an active reflection of a society in flux. But behind the scenes, one brother was quietly rewriting the rules of what this show and television itself could be. Tom's quiet transformation. Tom Smothers' quiet transformation, while CBS focused on securing Sunday night viewership, Tom Smothers was engineering a quiet revolution behind the curtain of a variety show. As a product of the 1960s counterculture, Tom was increasingly compelled to use the platform not just for entertainment but for reflection and resistance. Instead of confronting CBS head-on, he opted for a subtler approach, embedding political and social commentary in ways that initially escaped the network's scrutiny. Comedy sketches took on double meanings. Folk songs served as allegories, and satire replaced slapstick. It was a deliberate, calculated evolution that began at the edges before it reached the center. Unlike typical television activism, Tom's transformation was not declarative but strategic. He pushed against the network's guardrails not with defiance, but with timing and subtlety. For example, while CBS expected the inclusion of mainstream musical guests, Tom booked figures like Pete Seeger and Joan Baez, artists known for their anti-establishment views. Their presence, while defensible on artistic grounds, introduced political undercurrents that reshaped the viewer's experience. Tom framed these choices as entertainment, not protest, allowing him to retain control while advancing a deeper message. It wasn't just what was being said, it was how and when it was delivered. The comedic voice of the show matured over time. Tom brought in a new generation of writers, like Steve Martin and Rob Reiner, who were steeped in satirical culture and had a healthy degree of skepticism toward authority. From one-liners, the material had evolved into parables, from gags into commentaries. The sketches began as mere mimicry of press conferences, political advertising, and religious sermons for the sake of laughter. As mirrors of the American power structures, Tom seldom used his screen time to frame ideas. Instead of dominating them, this direct contact and behind-the-scenes working represented his quiet transformation, really, his shaping of the show not as a star but along with strategies. This shaping eventually would alter the whole relationship that television had with politics. Tom's gradual infusion of commentary paved the way for the show's more overtly political segments later on, such as Pat Paulson's campaign satire and David Steinberg's short sermonettes. His achievements weren't even just about what he said, though. They also had to do with proving that comedy could wage tactical assaults challenging, educating, and provoking within the confines of primetime television. By the time CBS understood what was changing, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had already become something they never intended. Much more than a variety show, but a frontline of the battle for free speech and media responsibility. Radical guests and musical performances as the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour gained traction. It became increasingly clear that its musical guests were not chosen solely for entertainment value. They were voices of a generation demanding change. Unlike other variety shows of the time, which largely featured apolitical or sanitized acts, Tom Smothers invited artists whose music directly addressed the political and social upheavals of the 1960s. Pete Seeger's appearance was a landmark moment, blacklisted from network television since the McCarthy era. Seeger performed his anti-war ballad Waist Deep in The Big Muddy, a thinly veiled criticism of President Lyndon B. Johnson and the Vietnam War. CBS initially censored the segment, but following public outcry and Tom Smothers' persistent advocacy, the network aired it, marking one of the first overtly political songs broadcast in American primetime. The show continued to use its musical stage as a forum for cultural protest. Joan Baez, a prominent anti-war and civil rights activist, used her appearances to highlight issues beyond the typical variety show fare. In one controversial moment, she dedicated a song to her then-husband, David Harris, who had been imprisoned for resisting the draft. Although the dedication was cut from the U.S. broadcast, the performance itself drew attention to the personal cost of political conviction. Acts like Jefferson Airplane brought the aesthetics of the psychedelic movement to the mainstream, performing songs that referenced substance culture and generational disillusionment. Their music, though coded, was an unmistakable call to consciousness for young viewers. Perhaps no performance epitomized the tension between rebellion and broadcast standards more than The Who's infamous appearance. Famously riotous on stage, the band ended their performance of My Generation when they smashed their instruments, shorting out CBS sound system for the duration of the live broadcast. Although clearly part of a staged act, it represented a wider rejection of institutional norms, a metaphor appropriate for a show bent on dismantling the very conventional structures of television. Each musical performance was a cultural statement, with CBS's national platform providing the widest exposure to provoke thought, challenge authority, and voice protest movements. In the confines of CBS, the executives were becoming increasingly anxious about the musical choices of the program. What began as mild rebellion had turned into outright resistance, both lyrically and through the presence of artists themselves, many of whom had been blacklisted and banned, previously considered too controversial for network television. This left the network with no other option. As more of its affiliates in conservative markets voiced their concerns and sponsors became uncomfortable, CBS began to tighten its control over any guest bookings on the show while closely scrutinizing its musical content. Nevertheless, the Smothers Brothers and their creative team believed music would change public opinion, and that television could be more than passive entertainment. It could be an active change agent. Satire meets politics. Satire meets politics. Among the most memorable elements of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was comedian Pat Paulsen's recurring role as a deadpan mock presidential candidate. Introduced during the 1968 election cycle, Paulsen's fictional campaign was designed as a parody, but it quickly became a sharp commentary on the state of American politics. Using a monotone delivery and deliberately absurd promises, Paulsen ridiculed the language of real politicians, exposing the emptiness and circular logic often found in political speeches. Lines like, "If elected, I will build more potholes to test the patience of voters," became instant classics, resonating with a generation disillusioned by political doublespeak, the Vietnam War, and governmental overreach. Paulsen's skits were deceptively simple, but their underlying critique was razor-sharp. By mimicking the rhetorical style of actual candidates, he made the flaws in their logic and the hollowness of campaign promises unmistakably clear. The character claimed to be against violence, war, and especially aggression, yet refused to offer any solutions, mirroring the political paralysis of the time. The satire reflected the broader feeling among young Americans that the political system was not only ineffective but also fundamentally disconnected from the needs and voices of everyday citizens. His fictional campaign slogan, "I've upped my standards, now up yours," became a tongue-in-cheek motto for the politically cynical. It must also be noted that the success attached to the part was because of its accessibility. Unlike direct statements on the war or musical protests, even the satire of Paulsen was couched in terms of absurdity that enabled it to evade censorship, attracting both disenchanted youths and, indeed, conservative viewers. Many viewed it as harmless fun. This said, the campaign had a wide-ranging impact. Paulsen campaign buttons and posters were distributed on college campuses, and requests for more appearances poured in. Some fans even wrote his name in on actual ballots. Though the campaign was indeed a sham, it engendered genuine discussion about the weaknesses of the American electoral system, as well as the use of humor to illuminate awkward truths. Pat Paulsen aided in the way of a parody campaign. This gag would become one of the show's most famous recurring segments and one of the earliest incarnations of political satire in television sketch comedy. It established the grounds for future programs such as Saturday Night Live and The Daily Show, in which parody of political figures became the cornerstone of cultural critique. Through the 1990s, Paulsen continued to run satirical campaigns in real elections, reminding people that laughter is an act of resistance. The character lived on as the real meaning of that legacy, a legacy that was always with the Smothers Brothers, was that, even in a tightly controlled audience of CBS. Satire nonetheless muddied the calm waters and spoke straight to the angst of a nation in crisis. Sermon Controverses. David Steinberg's Sermon Controverses, one of the most explosive flashpoints in the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour's history, was the inclusion of David Steinberg's irreverent sermonettes, satirical monologues that parodied religious sermons while weaving in sharp political commentary. Steinberg, a rising comedian and Second City alumnus, brought a new edge to the show's already evolving tone. Beginning in late 1968, his segments mocked the sanctity of religious authority by blending biblical stories with modern-day political situations. These routines, while humorous, often targeted the intersection of religion, war, and power, making them deeply controversial, particularly in conservative regions of the country. The turning point came with Steinberg's October 1968 appearance, in which he delivered a sermon parody comparing Moses' defiance of Pharaoh to young people protesting the Vietnam War and resisting the draft. In one version of the sketch, Moses, standing in for the American conscience, looked at Pharaoh and declared, "Sorry, Mr. President, take your army and go. I will not help you any longer." The allusion to then-President Nixon was unmistakable. Several CBS affiliates, especially in the South and Midwest, refused to air the segment, deeming it blasphemous and anti-American. CBS reportedly received over 300 complaints in a single week following the broadcast, signaling a major backlash from viewers who believed the show had crossed a moral and patriotic line. CBS executives were apprehensive about the political views expressed in the show. The sermonettes created an intensification of the infighting. The word went out that if Steinberg continued to appear on the show, that would seriously threaten the network. However, Tom Smothers ignored the edict and invited Steinberg back for a 1969 segment that would be the final straw.